The Governor's Awards 2025 were never meant to be a quiet event, but no one could have predicted the magnitude of shock that rippled across Hollywood the moment Dakota Johnson and Jamie Dornan stepped onto the red carpet. It wasn't simply the fact that they appeared at the same event, something rare in recent years after waves of rumors, whispers, and the lingering shadow of their 50 Shades legacy. It was the way the crowd reacted. Gasps broke out before camera shutters even started clicking, and a sudden rush of movement swept across the press line as every photographer fought for the perfect shot of a moment many believed would never happen again. Under the shimmering lights of the Dolby Ballroom, the two of them looked calm, composed, almost regal, yet there was an undeniable electricity in the air, something that made even the most seasoned entertainment reporters lean forward as though witnessing the beginning of a new era. As the night unfolded, murmurs of speculation grew louder. People noticed the way industry veterans whispered to each other, eyebrows raised, nodding toward Dakota and Jamie each time their names were mentioned. Rumors had circulated for weeks that the Academy was planning to honor two major figures whose contributions to modern cinema had reshaped the emotional intimacy of storytelling. Still, no one expected the announcement to include both of them, together. When the words finally echoed across the hall, Dakota Johnson and Jamie Dornan, recipients of the 2025 Governor's Tribute, the room erupted in a standing ovation so powerful it felt more like a coronation than an award. Even actors with decades-long careers stood and clapped, acknowledging the impact the pair had made, whether Hollywood wanted to admit it or not. Dakota's reaction was the first captured by cameras. A stunned, breathless moment where her hand hovered near her chest, eyes widening as though she didn't believe she belonged on the same list as the legends being honored that night. Meanwhile, Jamie's face tightened with emotion, not surprise, but something deeper, almost reflective, as though the recognition forced him to confront the long journey that had led him here, through praise, criticism, heavy scandal cycles, and personal storms. Together, they rose from their seats, each step toward the stage charged with a mixture of nostalgia, gratitude, and unspoken history. Even from afar, it was clear to everyone watching that this wasn't merely an award, it was a moment of acknowledgement for a pair who had carried both the weight of fame and the burden of being endlessly misunderstood. Walking up the steps to the stage, Dakota subtly reached for the sleeve of her gown as though grounding herself in the surrealness of it all. Jamie glanced at her briefly, just enough to steady her but not enough to spark unnecessary headlines. Yet that moment alone set the internet ablaze. Fan accounts screencapped it instantly, calling it the look that defined the night, while gossip sites framed it as an undeniable emotional connection. But those who were there in person sensed something different. This wasn't about romance. This was about two actors who had endured a decade of being defined by each other, now receiving an honor that finally separated myth from reality and spotlighted their individual growth. When they reached the podium, the applause didn't die down. It grew louder, spreading across the room like a wave. Directors who once doubted them now applauded with pride. Producers who initially underestimated them now nodded in respect. Dakota blinked rapidly, clearly overwhelmed, and Jamie's jaw tensed the way it always did when he was holding back more emotion than he wanted to show. A member of the awards committee later said, "It felt like we were watching two people step out of the shadows of their past and into the legacy they'd earned." Before either of them spoke, the lights dimmed slightly, framing them in a warm, golden glow. It was an unintentional but strikingly symbolic tableau. Dakota and Jamie standing side by side, not as co-stars, not as tabloid targets, not as the subject of endless speculation, but as two artists finally being honored for the craft they fought so hard to be recognized for. What stunned the room even more was what came next. Not the award, not the applause, but the emotional truth embedded in their speeches. Truths Hollywood had been waiting years to hear but never expected would be spoken on the same night, on the same stage, with the same trembling sincerity. Because it wasn't the honor that shook Hollywood. It was what Dakota and Jamie chose to reveal once they held the microphone. When the applause finally softened, Dakota stepped toward the microphone first, her hands trembling just slightly, though she masked it well with a composed smile. The entire room leaned in, sensing that whatever she was about to say would not be just another polished Hollywood acceptance speech. Her voice, when it emerged, carried a softness that silenced even the farthest corners of the ballroom. She spoke about the journey, about how her early years in the industry were met with skepticism, how she struggled with the constant weight of expectations tied to her family legacy, and how, despite it all, she found her voice through roles that challenged her, frightened her, and forced her to grow. But then, unexpectedly, her tone shifted, deepened. She spoke about the difficult years, the rumors that clawed their way into her personal life, the tabloid narratives that twisted every gesture into a headline, and the painful pressure of having her relationships dissected for entertainment. As the audience listened, captivated, Dakota paused, breathing in slowly before saying something that made the room still entirely. Some people think strength is about staying silent, but I learned that real strength is letting yourself be seen, even when the world misunderstands you. There was a tremor in her voice, and the raw authenticity of it struck something deeply human in everyone watching. Jamie's reaction didn't go unnoticed. He stared at Dakota with an expression so layered, pride, gratitude, shared history, that several audience members shifted in their seats, sensing the unspoken story between them. When it was his turn to speak, he approached the microphone with a steadiness that contrasted Dakota's gentle vulnerability, but the moment he began, it was clear he carried his own emotional storm. He spoke of years where he doubted himself, where criticism overshadowed his accomplishments, where he questioned whether he belonged in this industry at all. He talked about the difficulty of being defined by a role that became both his breakthrough and his burden. Then, with a brief glance at Dakota, he admitted something that made the air in the room thicken. I was ready to walk away once. Truly walk away. But someone reminded me that sometimes the hardest path is the one worth staying on. His voice grew rough at the edges, revealing more pain than glamour, and several audience members exchanged glances. They knew exactly who he was talking about. The emotional weight of their combined speeches created a silence that felt sacred. Even the cameras lowered slightly, as though reluctant to interrupt the intimacy unfolding on stage. As Jamie continued, he spoke of resilience learned the hard way, through sleepless nights, through public mistakes, through the quiet battles no one ever sees. I stand here today, he said, not because I never fell, but because I refused to stay down. The power in his voice wasn't bravado, it was truth earned through scars. And then, in a moment that would replay endlessly across social media, Dakota reached out and lightly touched his arm. An instinctive gesture of support that sent shockwaves through the room. It lasted only a second, but the emotion behind it was unmistakable. What happened next was the moment that truly shook Hollywood. Jamie turned toward Dakota fully, not just with a thankful nod but with the sincerity of someone acknowledging a person who had changed the course of his life. We survived storms, he said, speaking directly to her even though the entire room was listening. And whatever people think they know, only we understand the truth of what we walked through. The audience drew in a collective breath. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't scandalous. It was something far more rare. Two people honoring a connection forged in vulnerability, trust, and the relentless scrutiny of fame. Dakota blinked rapidly, struggling to maintain composure, and whispered just loud enough for the microphone to catch. "Thank you, for saying that." The simplicity of her words made them even more powerful. A second standing ovation broke out, this one louder, more emotional, as though the entire industry was acknowledging not just their artistry but their humanity. Directors wiped their eyes discreetly. Actors who had once dismissed them now saw them through a new lens. Even members of the Academy exchanged knowing looks. Tonight had become more than an awards ceremony. It had become a moment of reckoning. But the event's most surprising twist came after they stepped off stage. A producer who had been part of the selection committee later revealed that Dakota and Jamie had shared a private conversation in a secluded corner of the ballroom before the ceremony began. Nearly an hour long, hushed, intense, with expressions that moved from tense to warm to almost tearful. No one knew what they discussed. But after hearing their speeches, the industry began to speculate that perhaps the true story between them, buried beneath years of whispered rumors and misinterpreted headlines, was far deeper than anyone realized. Hollywood didn't just applaud Dakota Johnson and Jamie Dornan that night. It witnessed two people reclaim their narratives. And as the governor's ballroom emptied and the night's buzz spread across the world, one question echoed everywhere. What exactly did they say to each other before walking onto that stage? And did tonight mark an ending, or a beginning?